since we are at a conference celebrating the Romantic Manifesto, I thought it would be valuable and interesting to explore one of the key concepts of that book, which is sense of life. But I wanted to expand it a little beyond what I think people are used to, because much of the talk of art and the arts, in objectivist circles anyway, tends to hover over the 19th and 20th centuries. So mostly the good in the 19th and the bad in the 20th. But I've always taken to heart the idea that art is a universal need of man qua man. And so I've always tried to look to the furthest corners I could find to investigate art by way of understanding man and appreciating him. And so what I'm going to do in my lecture is explore the sense of life in medieval Persia. Now, a terminological clarification: Persia is basically synonymous with Iran. But if I say Iran, the first thing that comes to people's minds is the bad stuff. But the word Persia is sort of indelibly associated with more cultural things: Persian cuisine, Persian poetry, Persian cat, Persian carpet, and so on. So I use the old word for Persia. And I'm not alone in viewing the subject this way. Okay. Well, I want to make three endeavors or three parts in this talk. The first will be to use this concept of sense of life to get at the inner life of people in medieval Persia. The second part will be seeing how they concretized that inner life, how they brought it to the perceptual level in their outer life in the form of art and architecture. And lastly, I want to suggest that the ability to see the connection between these two, the inner life and the outer life, in the way that Ayn Rand did, is extremely important and very, very exciting intellectual breakthrough. But I will come to all that. Okay, now, sense of life is a personal thing, as life is an individual thing. We all have our individual sense of life. But does this mean that you can't talk of a cultural sense of life? Not necessarily. And Ayn Rand herself, in another work, not the Romantic Manifesto, wrote, quote, "A culture, like an individual, has a sense of life, or rather, the equivalent of a sense of life, an emotional atmosphere created by its dominant philosophy, by its view of man and of existence. This emotional atmosphere represents a culture's dominant values and serves as the leitmotif of a given age, setting its trends and its style." So the age that I want to look at now is, or what I want to bring to that age is this central concept of the quote I just read. It's the emotional atmosphere created by the dominant philosophy. Remember, what you feel comes from what you think. What you think is not always explicitly stated. But conversely, we can't talk to people in medieval Persia. We have to dig for their dominant philosophy using what remains of their works, and that's what I've been doing for a large number of years now. So medieval Persia, and the way I'm using it, refers to the Persian world in roughly the year 1000 to roughly the year 1500. Now, to contextualize, in the 7th century, about 650 or so, the ancient Iranian Empire was overrun by the Arabs, who brought Islam and toppled the Persian Empire, and many things changed. Persian culture was essentially submerged for a couple of centuries. The language stopped being used because Arabic was the language of the conquerors. The religion changed to Islam, and we have little idea of what went on in those first years culturally. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, there's a renaissance, if you will, a revitalization of Persian culture. It kind of comes back from its semi-dead status. The language has changed into a new, very flexible and supple poetic language. Architecture is beginning to be built, and basically things are really in full swing by the 11th century, which is when I'll begin my period. You could consider the years after 1500 also medieval, but things really begin to change into a more recognizable modern form around the 16th century, the end of the 16th century. Okay. Now, this is the region I'm talking about. Persia is synonymous with the word Iran, but not the borders of Iran. In fact, the Persian world or Persian cultural sphere was actually much larger, as you can see in this map. You can see that it spread all the way from what is today eastern Iraq, which has always been called Persian Iraq. In fact, the name Baghdad is a Persian word, all the way to Afghanistan and even Pakistan in the east, and Uzbekistan in the north. Today is a Turkic republic in Central Asia, but would have been considered part of Persia back in the day. Okay, well, as I say, to get at the medieval Persian sense of life, you have to consider their philosophical or metaphysical premises. So let's turn to a couple of those as they are reconstructible from the literary remnants. Well, on first glance, things look pretty good, because you could make a case that the medieval Persians thought that the world was real, that it's not an illusion, it's not a dream, it's not a veil, the veil of Maya, that sort of thing. It is real. In fact, only people who thought the world was real would have been able to make the kinds of advances that the medieval Persian world made in medicine, science, optics, mathematics, and so forth. That was in turn driven by their idea that the world is causal, that the world is driven by cause and effects which you can discover. Now, we would consider some of the causes to not hold muster, for example, pass muster. For example, there's a strong belief in astrology, so the motions of stars and planets affect things on Earth. In medicine, they believe in the four humors, which is the ancient Greek idea that we have four kind of fluids whose balance or imbalance determines our health. But the thing is, they viewed those as real and causal, not as arbitrary miracles to be prayed for. And all of this adds up to a view of the world as pretty much open to reason. In fact, some Persian philosophers even tried to explain things all the way up to God by using reason. Now, there's a dramatic backlash shortly afterwards, but in the early period, this is what they were thinking. So, in comparison to, say, contemporary Europe, which was in the dark and early Middle Ages, very much superstitious, the medieval Persian world was doing pretty well intellectually. But there's a lot of qualifiers which kind of spoil the picture. Because when you think about it, you really have to say they believe the world is semi-real. Okay? And their big problem with the world is that it changes out from under you. Okay? So what you think is true today about people or events or the world is just going to change around on you tomorrow. The world is really only semi-causal, because sure, there's cause and effect and astrology and all these things, but God can step in anytime he wants and snip the causal chain and make something else happen. And he even gives this power to his favored mystics who work miracles. Okay, so the world is not entirely causal. In fact, as part of the backlash I mentioned, there is a wholehearted rejection of causality, root and branch, by the philosopher Al-Ghazali. And the world is only semi-open to reason because you have to consider all the claims of religion, okay, about not only God, but prophecy, miracles, resurrection, the afterlife, heaven and hell. All these things that reason has absolutely no purchase on, but you are expected to believe are true. So for these reasons, the world is only semi-open to reason, semi-open to value pursuit. Now, there's a catch-all metaphor that is very common in medieval Persian culture to kind of bring all these together, and that is the idea of the turning wheel of the heavens. So they noticed, as people have since forever, that the stars and planets rotate through the sky. And they envision this as a big wheel. It's like the wheel of fate. Okay, this is sort of bringing together their complaints about temporality and transience, the fact that people age, beauty fades, food spoils, metal rusts, buildings and empires fall down, nothing sticks around. And that hits them very hard, and they have this concept of the wheel of the heavens. My Persian professor once said that if a poet ever mentions the wheel of the heavens, you know that bad news is coming. Because the idea is that the wheel of the heavens, it can lift you up and raise you to heights of, glory and success and wealth and power, and you have everything you want. But sooner or later, as wheels do, it's going to turn and throw you back into the dust. which is where we all end up, right? The wheel ends up turning everybody into the grave. So this is deeply felt, and this image really if you imagine the wheel picking you up and then throwing you down, that's a very good catch-all metaphor for the problems they have with reality. Now, distilling all this into a sense of life is difficult, but happily a colleague of mine actually nominated a certain concept for the national emotion of Persia. And this is in Persian gham-e-shirin, which in English means sweet sorrow. Okay, gham is sorrow, pain, suffering, and shirin means sweet. Okay, so it's a special kind of bittersweet melancholy. It is not nihilism or complete fatalism. The medieval Persians did not walk around weeping and gnashing their teeth or wishing to escape it all by finding nirvana or anything that their neighbors were doing. Okay? They put up with it because they think that it's a sweet sorrow. It's sorrow because people die, beauty fades, all the things that I mentioned. Right? Values escape you, but they're still values, and that's why it's sweet. You can pursue values, you just have to know that this is the way of the world. When beauty fades, etc., it's just in a way, because that's the way the world is. Okay, they're not blaming it on God or anything like that. It's a much more metaphysical premise than that. I should also say that in medieval Persian culture, there is no concept of man's innate depravity or of original sin. Okay, so unlike the Christian West, they did not have St. Augustine or Pope Innocent III kind of looming over them and going, "You deserve it, worm." There's no voice like that. Okay, it's not that we deserve it because we're evil or depraved. It's because that's how the world works. So enjoy the values, but savor the pain when they disappear because it's telling you what's real. Okay, so in turning to the second part of my talk, I will ask, well, if this is their sense of life, if we can sum it up in this concept, sweet sorrow, well, how did they give it material expression? Okay, Ayn Rand once said that art is the voice of man's sense of life. Well, what voices can we hear describing the medieval Persian sense of life from that period? Well, I've picked examples from 3 of the arts. The first is poetry, which is the most explicit of the arts. The second is painting, which is visual and therefore quite easy to deal with. And the third is architecture, which is a tougher thing to navigate, but I will give it a go. What I know about medieval Persian music is very short, so if anybody wants to hear it, you can ask in the question and answer period. And there is no sculpture, so that's easy as well. All right. Now turning to Persian poetry. Poetry is exceptionally well developed in Persian culture. Even today, every taxi driver in every little village in Iran can recite at least some verses of the great national works. And there's an unusual number of very high-quality poets. Unfortunately, I can't turn this into a disquisition on all the magic of Persian poetry because it's odious to try and describe all the verbal fireworks and grammatical tricks that they play. And translations always sound awful to me. They sound silly when the Persian is absolutely beautiful. But what I can discuss are some of the themes that appear in poetry. So, a very important theme in medieval Persian poetry, from the beginning, is cruel fate. Okay, remember the turning wheel. It's cruel fate which takes people who think they have it made, who think that they're on top of the world, when they're only on top of the cycle of the wheel and they get thrown down. And relishing the pain of their downfall, not in a gleeful or envious way, but because, again, this is the sweet sorrow, is a major theme in poetry. And the arch example of this is an episode from the Persian national epic. So the Persians have an epic poem called Shahnameh, which was completed in the year 1010, so we just passed the millennial. It is a versification of the history of Iran, of Persia, from the beginning of the world until the Arab invasions knocked over the ancient empire, which is viewed as a national catastrophe. Now, among the many stories in the Shahnameh, there are many about a character named Rostam, R-O-S-T-A-M. Now, Rostam has been called the Persian Hercules because he's huge, enormously strong, and his job is sort of to protect the Persian throne from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, he's not a king. He doesn't want to be king, but his job in life, and he lives for like 600 years, is to beat back threats to the throne. So he fights monsters, he defeats whole armies, the works that heroes are expected to do. Now, in the course of his adventures, Rostam has a one-night stand with a princess, which results, unbeknownst to Rostam, in the birth of a son. So he has his one-night stand, and then he goes off to continue doing his job. But the princess is with child, and she gives birth to a boy named Sohrab, S-O-H-R-A-B. Now, here's the thing. Rostam is vaguely aware that he has a son out there somewhere, but Sohrab knows that his father is the great hero Rostam, and he wants nothing more than to find him and join up with him so that the two of them can kind of conquer the world and rule as father and son. But he doesn't know what Rostam looks like. So he basically gets himself in a position where he can go off and fight Persians until he finds Rostam. And the poet, ingeniously, I think, takes every opportunity to make them miss the opportunity to know who the other is. For example, Sohrab kidnaps a Persian soldier and forces him, the army is sort of lined up on the field, and he forces him to say who each of the heroes is. And that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so. But this guy thinks, if I tell him who Rostam is, and he defeats Rostam, then it's my fault, right? It's on my head. So he pretends he doesn't know. Rostam, he's around here somewhere. Okay, even when they meet face to face, Sohrab says, hey, you're a pretty big strapping guy. I bet you're Rostam. And Rostam says, no, I'm nothing. I'm puny. You should see the real Rostam, which is sort of psychological warfare. So they fight and they fight and they fight, and they're evenly matched and neither can beat the other. So here's the real cruelty of fate. Rostam breaks off from the battle and he goes off to sort of wash his wounds and he prays to God. It turns out that since he was little, Rostam was so strong that he couldn't even walk because his feet would sink into the stones. So back then, he asked God to take away a little bit of his strength so that he could at least live a somewhat normal life. And God said, okay, and he did. So when he cannot defeat Sohrab, Rostam says, hey God, can I please have all of my strength back? And without a word, God gives it to him, with the result that Rostam finally manages to kill Sohrab. He sticks a dagger in his chest. Sohrab knows that his time is up because the poet says that the sort of wheel of fate had circled over his head. And as he's dying, he says, fate brought me to this, but you're in real trouble because when my father Rostam finds out what you've done, he's going to take care of you. And of course, Rostam is shocked and he says, who says your father is Rostam? And it turns out that Sohrab has a little token that Rostam had left the princess, which he carries on his arm. So Rostam knows, as the boy is bleeding to death in front of him, that he has killed his own son, unknowingly. And this is a very tragic tragedy. It's been translated, or it's been rendered in English by Matthew Arnold. And it is one of the saddest moments in the whole Shahnameh. And for this reason, it is extremely widespread and well-known, and it's a great example of the poetic theme of cruel fate. Now, a second theme in medieval Persian poetry is unrequited love, which is a passionate longing for a value that you are inherently unable to get. And it's present from the very beginning. If anybody has experienced unrequited love, you know just what this is like. In fact, when I was an early grad student and I was reading this stuff, I thought it was ridiculous. I mean, the poet is talking about, rolling in the dust of his lover's lane, and she won't even look at him. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, man up, you're being ridiculous. But then I encountered unrequited love, and it all turned around. And then I really got it. Happily, I achieved requital, but the poet never does. Okay. Now, the third poetic theme, it follows logically from the first two. If you thought life was this way, you'd be pretty inclined to escape it by drinking. And getting drunk is an age-old theme in Persian poetry. Now, in the early years of what I'm talking about, Persian poets tend to see wine as just a sort of salve for the pains of life. Okay. Frequently in the Shahnameh, the heroes and the kings and stuff will get together at a banquet and wash away their troubles, as it's put, or the next morning wash away their hangover, and plenty of wine drinking. So it's fairly secular. Now the thing is, over time, all of these themes get colonized by the mystics, to the extent that after about 1400, you just can't expect non-mystical meaning to be found in the poetry. So for example, cruel fate. Well, the world is cruel. It will turn on you. You're destined for the dust anyway, so you should look beyond the world. Okay, you should attach your heart to the creator of the world because he doesn't change and won't go away. And possibly the most famous line of Persian poetry says, "The world, O brother, remains for no one. So attach your heart to the world creator, and that's enough." Right? That's sufficient. Right? Unrequited love becomes the mystic's passionate longing to annihilate himself and become one with the divine unity. Okay, so the illusion of self and all the things that cling to us from the world, he wants to shatter that and become one with God, which is inherently impossible, hence the unrequited aspect. And drunkenness, very easy metaphor for an ecstatic escape from the shackles of reason. Right? Reason tells you that this has to be this and this has to be that. Well, when you're drunk, none of that matters. Okay, and this is a very common metaphor for the mystical experience, so common that even in the 1950s and 60s, the Ayatollah Khomeini was writing poems about going to the tavern and getting drunk. Now, he certainly did not mean this in the real sense. It's all mystical imagery, very, very well established. Okay, now turning to painting, which is somewhat more concrete for our purposes. In painting, we can take guidance again from the Romantic Manifesto because Ayn Rand tells us to look in painting for two things. Right? The subject tells us what the artist's views on metaphysics were. What did he think was true and real and important about life, important enough to put in his painting? And the style tells you about his psychoepistemology. So the level of functioning on which his consciousness feels comfortable. And there's a whole spectrum from barely conscious to sort of hyper-focused and alert. And these come out in painting. Now, from medieval Persia, what remains of painting tends to be on ceramics or later in manuscript illustration. There are no canvases such as we think of. We know there were wall paintings in palaces, but the palaces have all been destroyed. So I've picked a handful of objects which are actually in the Cleveland Museum of Art, and all but one are on display, so anybody who's so inclined can go check them out. This is a ceramic dish which was made in about the year 1200. So as far as subject goes, let me back up. It's made in a very clever style called luster painting, in which the technique of mixing pigments, painting, and firing leaves a microscopic sheen of metallic particles, and that's why it shines. Okay, so if you look in the bowl, you see that the subject is a polo player. Okay, so there's a figure on a horse with the polo mallet in hand. Polo is the sport of kings. Okay, this is a vision of the good life. Okay, and it's not only a polo player. By medieval Persian standards, this is an absolutely perfectly beautiful polo player because they inherited a sort of Central Asian aesthetic of big round moon face, olive-shaped eyes, and a very small mouth. That's considered perfect beauty. Now, that's as far as the subject goes. Now, for the style, notice, it's very flat. It is not realistic. Now, it's not paper cutouts, but there's definitely virtually no effort to show space or volume. And, importantly, there is a strong desire not to leave any space unfilled. Okay, so it's not that the polo player has run into the bushes. He's just surrounded by kind of arabesque plant motifs. Now, this is another ceramic. This is actually a wall tile made about 60 years after the previous. Tiles like this would have been made to cover the walls of palaces. And if you imagine star tiles like this would have been interleaved with four-pointed cross-shaped tiles, so like that. And then if you kind of work it out, they all fit together. Again, you can see that there's two people in robes, and they're apparently sitting in a garden, and they're drinking together, probably listening to music. Again, a vision of the good life. Okay? And there is also this desire not to let anything go untouched by the artist's brush. Okay? So their robes are very elaborately decorated or ornamented, and in the angles formed by the star, you get birds or plant motifs. And even the exterior border is filled with Persian poetry, which is cheesy sort of doggerel about the lover's black locks and things like that. But they don't want to leave any space blank. The only reason this is blank is because it broke and the museum restored it. Okay. Now, one of the most important forms of painting in medieval Persia, in the later part of medieval Persia, is manuscript painting. So paintings that illustrate books. So this is a double-page illustration from a manuscript made in about mid-1440s. It depicts an outdoor party in a garden. So once again, this is the good life. This is what people with the power and money to pay for paintings like this thought was a good time. Okay? So you can see there's these princesses sitting on a carpet under a little sort of parasol there. There's a stream and flowers. There are people lined up, some of them in apparent respect. Some people are just arriving, so they've got their horses. One of them has a hunting cheetah with him. Many people are kneeling, and there is a bouncer driving off the people who were not invited. Okay, now, that's for the subject. Now, as for the style, notice, okay, it's very, very flat. The perspective has been hiked up so that you see everybody from a very high angle. Nobody gets concealed behind a realistic crowd. Everybody is sort of elevated into position so you can see him or her, including horses. The lines and colors are very clear. Okay, nothing blends into anything else. All the borders are quite sharp. All the colors are as saturated as they could manage. And there's uniform lighting. Okay, you don't get the sense that the sun is in a certain place, shining in a certain direction and causing shadows, because there are no shadows. If you go to a close-up, you can see sort of the purpose of this high perspective is to let you see the nice details that the painter has been able to get in. Like these would have been Chinese blue and white porcelain, probably imported from China because of the period we're in. But the tables are tipped up to show that. All of the details, as I say, are individually drawn. Okay, every petal, every flower has to be outlined precisely, so nothing fades out of your vision or is blurry. Okay, and very importantly, not only no shadows, but not even any mass. Okay, nobody is deforming so much as a blade of grass with his weight. Okay, people are stacked up. You're meant to look at them and admire the landscape without this troublesome sense of a 3D world, right? Because mass, volume, shadow, movement through volumetric space, these are the tokens of physical reality, which is the source of all their problems. So they stay away from it in painting. Okay. Now, this is really the arch example, or the apotheosis, if you want to call it, of this kind of painting. This is from a manuscript made at the end of the period I'm talking about. It is from a copy of the Shahnameh, so the Persian national epic, which was made for the Shah of Persia. The manuscript probably took about 20 years to complete because it is extremely luxurious. For one thing, it's very big. It's about a foot wide by a foot and a half tall. So this is a hefty book. And there were 258 paintings, which is orders of magnitude more than you usually got in a manuscript. So if you look at this page, this is a page of actually our friend Rostam, who's doing one of his heroic deeds, and he has gone off to a cave, and he's killing a monster which has been terrorizing Persia. The monster is called the White Div, D-I-V. That's the sort of characteristic monster in Persian thinking. Now, all the stylistic characteristics I've talked about are present. Okay, so the precision, the sharp lines, the high perspective, and so forth, but they've been dialed up to 11. Okay, this is a really wonderful painting. I'll show you a close-up in a second. But another thing I want to point out is that for all of its sort of aesthetic wonders, it's a painting on a page. Okay, it makes no effort to hide the fact that it's part of a text. So this is what we call the text block, because you can see the verses have been written here. And the painting is actually bursting out of it, and the horse's butt sort of sticks out on the other side. Drawing your attention to the fact that this painting is part of a book. The margins are sprinkled with gold leaf, okay, so they'll be shining and reflecting as you look at the page. And more to the point, you can enjoy the painting all you want, but eventually you're going to turn the page. And this scene of a mighty hero battling a terrifying monster in a dark cave is going to curl and disappear to the side. Okay, so this is a close-up. Really an exceptionally fine Persian painting. It is in the Cleveland Museum of Art. To my knowledge, it's not on display. But you can't win them all. But this is an aesthetic that rewards very close viewing, okay, because that's what they like. They like to look and differentiate and integrate, right, using all the faculties of perception and consciousness to appreciate the sharp lines, the tight detail. I'm really taken with the horses. See, here's Rostam's horse, and he has chained its legs together so it doesn't run away. But the detail in its saddle and its blanket, I'm not sure what you call it, are incredibly tight. I mean, you really need a magnifying glass to appreciate all the sharp detail. Okay, so the skill goes into that, not into, say, making this look like a real cave. Everything is done with microscopic precision. Every petal and every leaf of these beautiful flowering trees, okay, or down on the ground here. The rocks have this very dreamlike level of detail. They kind of look like magical coral or something. And Rostam, of course, he's very decorative considering the violence of his act. He has cut off the leg of the white div and he's stabbing it in the liver right there. So, as I say, this is an aesthetic that really prizes tight details. In fact, in some paintings, not this one that I know of, there are hidden details that you're supposed to work for, like there are little faces in the coral rocks, or there will be an artist's signature written so small that people miss it for ages, as happened to one of my old bosses. Okay, so that's poetry and painting. Now I want to turn to the third art form I'll talk about, which is architecture. Now, architecture is somewhat harder to talk about as an art. I did my best, actually, at the last OCON last summer. Architecture is the art that stylizes the world you move around in. Okay. It's not something you stand there and look at, it's something that you inhabit, right? We don't live in trees, we don't live in caves, we live in buildings. No matter how small or simple, our world is a man-made one, okay? And so the world that man makes can reflect how man views that world. Now, in medieval Persian architecture, there's this decorative tendency, or this tendency to want to enjoy details at the expense of the sense of a kind of corporeal physical world, ironically, is present in a very corporeal art, namely architecture. The structures of the buildings at first are impressive, but you have to understand that there is very little innovation. There's a certain number of building types which simply continue. They do think of clever ways to hold up domes and to make the arches bigger and so forth, but there is really not the kind of work with space that you might imagine from an architecturally sophisticated people. They throw all of their considerable energy into decorating it, into ornamenting the architecture, into making the play that your eye has on surfaces the salient part of your architectural experience. Okay. Now, what I want to show you for an example is, I'll stick to one building, but it's an important one. This is the Great Mosque, or the Friday Mosque, or the Masjid-e-Jame in Isfahan in central Iran. You are looking at the courtyard. A traditional Iranian courtyard has, there we go, 4 of these projecting portals, so the 4th one is behind the photographer. This building was originally built in the 8th century. It was substantially rebuilt in the 11th century and continually refurbished and repaired and redecorated ever since, so that it actually is wonderful for forming a kind of living museum of Persian architecture. Because for century after century, whoever ruled Isfahan thought that the best way to leave his mark on the city was to somehow work on this building. Okay, so for example, the main part of the building was, as I say, rebuilt in, coming up on the year 1100, but this arcade, this series of double arches, wasn't added until the 1440s. Okay, so at the same time as the first painting I showed you. Now, as I say, the point they saw in architecture was using the building as a scaffolding on which to drape playgrounds for your eye. Now, if you take a look at this portal, it's called the Avon. If you look at this Avon on the right and step under it, okay, this is what you see. This technique of sometimes called honeycomb vaulting, of these arches kind of turned in 3 dimensions, going up to the top, are really staggering to look at, to process. They're very beautiful. They've been decorated with a combination of geometric design and stylized calligraphy. Okay, so this says God, this says Muhammad, this says God is great, and so on. But it has no structural function whatsoever. It is not holding anything up. It's hanging there. It's just fun to look at, not part of a corporeal building. Okay, and this is part of the arcade I mentioned. Okay, now, it's just beautiful. It's phenomenal ceramic work. And it's quite ingenious. If you look in these spaces left by the arches, okay, they're all related, but no 2 are alike. Okay, they're all a kind of coiling arabesque pattern which expands and shrinks to fill the space, but it's not a cookie cutter that they just stamp on each one. Each one is different. Okay? But behind this appreciation, you should know that this arcade is a pure mask. Okay? It was put in front of the entrance to the halls behind, and you can't even pass through the arches because the screen remains. Okay? These are not windows. They're simply arches, and when the arch behind ran out, okay, you whitewash it to take away some of the contrast, or better, to form a contrast with the colors of the mosaics out front. Now, when you go inside and you see some of the older stuff, it's a series of domes supported on columns, and the building has 476 domes, no 2 of which are alike. Okay? So there is amazing gymnastics with brickwork, much of which is completely non-structural. Okay? This skylight is really held up by this arch, not this combination of little arches. So there's an amazing amount of creativity for visual play, but very little sense of working with weight and space and the things that make architecture such a part of the physical world. It does result in some magnificent vistas. This is actually the space we were just looking at from a different angle. So there's the arches I was talking about. This is just beautiful. And you can also see by looking at the other domes in the picture that, as I say, they're all unique. They thought it valuable to expend time and energy designing a different design for each dome. And the triumph of the building is a northern chamber, which you see here, whose schematic, if you will, whose design has been compared to Gothic architecture in France, although this predates Gothic architecture by about 50 years. Because you can see the dome is supported on these pointed arches, which form a kind of descending ensemble based on the pointed arch and based on triple pointed arches. And in fact, it goes all the way down to the floor, which you can't see in the photograph I chose. Now, I mentioned Gothic. Notice one thing. Gothic is all about opening the walls, right? The fact that pointed arches carry weight so much better let them open up the windows. So Gothic interiors are quite bright, or at least flooded with light. This one is not, okay? They didn't think of that. Okay, what they like is the symmetry and the mathematical perfection of this descending triple arch motif, but they didn't think to check if it made it possible to open the windows or turn the walls into windows. If you go outside, this is a very plain exterior. Okay, now I will wind up with some observations on the connection between this inner life, this way of looking at the universe that the medieval Persians had, and the way they expressed it, and seeing that connection. Okay? So we have been talking about medieval Persian art and architecture. Okay? So this profoundly decorative interest they have in creating surfaces that are a joy for your eye to look at and to, as I say, differentiate and integrate and just do all the things that perception does. But they keep the real world at arm's length. Okay? There's no attempt for 3 dimensions or solidity or mass in the painting. Okay? The buildings tend to be uncreative structurally as they are superlatively creative ornamentally. And in poetry, we saw that there is a obsession with themes that come back to the sense of the world that's causing you to want to push it away, right? The sweet sorrow of a world that keeps turning out from under you. Well, that's what art, we've been saying that art concretizes a sense of life. Okay, that's what the art's doing. It's bringing this interior world people have to the outside. Okay, but keep pushing it. What makes that possible? I mean, how is it possible that people can have extremely diffuse, abstract, philosophical views of what's the world like? You know, can I know anything? What am I in the face of the titanic forces of nature? You know, how do they distill these into objects that can reflect it back at you and to later generations? That's made possible by metaphysical value judgments. Okay, because that's what a sense of life is ultimately based on, is if you would identify them philosophically and conceptually, they would be metaphysical value judgments. Okay, Ayn Rand identified these, it's a crucial discovery, as the universe-wide abstractions that your mind arrives at after integrating and integrating and integrating. It comes up with a whole view of the world. Is it that the world is rational and knowable and you can act and be happy in it? Or is it you can't know anything, it's a veil of tears, causality is a myth, and so on, or any of the infinite combinations of these things? And how that makes you feel about the world, well, that comes from premises. Okay? And we can seek out these premises, and it's these premises which are triggered, if you will, by the details of things like, well, there's no mass in this painting, or, well, this is a spectacular arcade, but I can't walk through it. Okay? And teasing these out is part of the science of aesthetics, which is now made a whole lot more interesting, valuable, and profoundly important by Ayn Rand's identification of what makes metaphysical value judgments necessary, and that's life. Okay? Consciousness evolved to guide action. We have minds so that we can live in the world, and we are gifted with a mind which integrates. And the super integrations that it makes are at the basis of our very concept of what we should even think about trying to do in this life. This can stop you dead in your tracks, or it can fire you up for a life of achievement and value pursuit. And it's crucial that Ayn Rand identified this connection to life, right? The fact that metaphysical value judgments are necessary to act and to achieve values in the world. Because man, Persian or not, finds himself plunked down in this nature, right? With nothing given to us. Okay? No fangs, no claws, no instincts, no automatic knowledge of what to do. We have to reason, we have to think about the world, and these thoughts issue in metaphysical value judgments, which we need confirmed. Okay? Ayn Rand is incredibly important for making this connection, that art is a biological need. We can look at it as Aristotle might have. It's a feature of a living being. This is something that we as living organisms do in order to live. It's not just curly cues are pleasant to look at, okay? Or some people just happen to have this innate desire to paint. It's that man, as a living being, needs to externalize and be able to contemplate that inner sense of life in order to feel that he's right about himself and the world and can proceed the way he thought he should. And that's why I offer this lecture, not out of any desire to be diverse or multicultural or any of those things, but out of reverent admiration for man and his creative pursuit of life. So thank you very much. I'll take any questions you might have.
Thanks so much for the talk. What's your top recommendation if I were going to read one book to learn more about Persia?
About Persia. There is a book called Lost Enlightenment by a guy named S. Frederick Starr with 2 R's. And it's a big one, it's a big book, but it's about the sort of rise and fall of what he's calling Central Asia. I would have called it sort of northeastern Greater Persia. The rise and fall of a rational, secular, causal viewpoint in what is now like Samarkand and Bukhara and Uzbekistan. It's an amazing book. He writes really well, and he's got a mastery of sources that some people can't even touch, like, articles in Tajik or Russian or whatever. My only qualifier is there is an irritating number of little mistakes, mostly probably because he farmed out some of the grunt work to graduate students who weren't up to it. So there's typos, and he gets people's names wrong, and there's that. But it's a wonderful read. So Lost Enlightenment by Frederick Starr. For art history as a whole, much broader than this, there are a couple good surveys of Islamic art out. One is by Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom. I think it's just called Islamic Arts. There's one by a guy named Robert Hillenbrand named Islamic Art and Architecture. They're much broader, but you can sort of focus on the chapters on Persia.
Great, thank you.
My question has to do with whether or not we can tie the positive elements of the culture you described to contemporary Iran. I watch videos of courageous women taking off their headscarves. Sometimes the horror of it, they're dancing in the streets to Western music. And a number of commentators have said, well, it's not just that during the Shah's time, people were exposed to Western values, but that there were strong, or at least some elements in the Iranian native culture, which are secular, don't tread on me, I want to enjoy life, I want to dance in the street, I want to have a bonfire at New Year's. Do you think that the developments you have discussed did in fact create a positive culture that to some extent still exists.
I'm not sure I would go as far as positive, but there are definitely pro-life elements to Persian culture. The enjoyment of life. Going back in the history of religions, early Iranian religion was much more sort of pro-achievement and happiness in this world than other religions of the time that I could think of. There is a strong, I think stronger than in other places, element of this sense that life has aspects that you should really savor. But it is definitely hamstrung by the bittersweet aspect, by the sense that the wheel's going to turn. Enjoy this New Year's celebration with the bonfire and so forth now, but whatever, it's over tomorrow. And a lot of what's wrong in the Islamic Republic is the anti-life element that was really foisted upon Persia by the Islamic invasions and what Islam sort of developed into. But that's a whole nother lecture.
Thank you.
You kind of just touched on this aspect, but I'm curious, to what extent was Persian life and the view of existence similar or different to, one, the Odyssey, and two, Plato in particular?
To Plato is your second one. To the Odyssey.
Just the general view of life that it projects.
I'm going to pass on that one because I think you're thinking of something specific that I'm not quite grasping.
I'm not,
As
I
to
promise.
Plato, there is a strong Neoplatonic influence in medieval Persian culture for many reasons. For one thing, it just fit. For another, they inherited texts that they thought were by Aristotle, which are actually Neoplatonist, and that wormed its way into their philosophy. But there's a lot of explicit Neoplatonism. Even in the most mystical of poets, they'll mention Plato because they know about that whole worldview. So there's definitely that in there. That's a little bit outside the sphere of my talk, but absolutely, that philosophical influence exists.
Would you characterize their outlook as more worldly or otherworldly?
It's a lot more worldly than their neighbors, but over the course of time, it got way more mystical. So, in the 11th century, let's say 1000 to 1100, or even maybe to 1200, the Middle East and Central Asia, Greater Iran, Greater Persia, let's call it, is a much better place to live than Christian Europe. It is much more rational, secular, interested in philosophy per se, and in making philosophy work for the world, but it's violently undercut first by philosophers themselves, and then in the 13th century, the whole place is a biblical scale Holocaust when the Mongols invade. And then it happened again when Tamerlane came through in the 14th century, and then it happened again when Nader Shah came through in the 18th century. So, sometimes you can't blame them for being a little pessimistic, but the mystical element is much more muted at the beginning and grows and grows and grows and grows.
Thank you.
Sure.
You actually just touched partially on my question with your answer a second ago, but I was going to ask, how did the many conquests Persia faced during this period, such as the Seljuks, Mongols, and Timurids, affect the culture over time?
Well, you're right. I touched on that. I was reading in one book years ago, I can't remember precisely what the subject was, but it noted that, in the 13th century, popular interest in mysticism seems to rise. And I was like, gee, why do you think that is? It's because the entire country was just put to the sword. People are going to look to the beyond for solace. I definitely think that the repeated, mostly mind-numbingly brutal invasions that Iran has suffered over the centuries left a mark in their mentality. But I sense myself gravitating towards a longer answer than I should give. So it's a big topic, but it's interesting. I mean, ask me later.
Thank you.
He kind of stole my question, so I'm going to kind of ask you, I mean, up until 1258 would be considered the Islamic Golden Age. So
So-called, yes.
so-called, to what extent is this exclusive to Persia versus the rest of the Abbasid Empire? And how much claim can Islam take for this sense of life?
Well, if you read the book I mentioned, Lost Enlightenment, Starr gives almost all the credit to not just Persia, but Central Asians. Like the whole translation movement by which they got all of these Greek texts in all these fields was actually driven by Central Asian immigrants to Baghdad who then left when they were done. I think much of what's good in Golden Age Islamic culture and what's at least interesting and beautiful in broader Islamic culture has its roots in Persia, definitely.
What's your favorite Persian poem?
What's my favorite Persian poem? I don't know if I have a favorite poem. I definitely have a favorite line, which I can't possibly foist on you. But it's by a poet named Hafez, who lived in Shiraz in the 14th century, and he's an absolutely brilliant poet. I didn't like him at first until this one line, which I randomly found in a book, just gripped me. And the neat thing about Hafez, and I'll wrap up with this because our time's running out, is that people just can't tell if he was a life-loving wine drinker or if it's all mystical imagery. Because, somebody will write a book saying Hafez is totally mystical. Every poem is shot through with, stuff about God and Islam and so on. And then 6 months later, somebody will write a book saying, nah, Hafez is totally worldly. He's just a drunk who writes poetry beautifully. After him, people are usually mystical, but he's got an amazing balance, and his Persian is spectacular. But again, that's not of general interest. Okay, thank you everybody for coming.
Thanks for watching. To help keep content like this free, consider supporting ARI by becoming a member at aynrand.org/membership.